Alrighty, well, let's get started here. So, thank you all for joining us here at the Tufts Research and Data Symposium for Food and Nutrition. Thank you for joining the workshop on effective oral communication of data-driven research with Dr. Patrick Webb. Very excited to have you all here today and to have him here with us. So, Dr. Webb is engaged in research and policy guidance around the globe as a director, for USAID's Feed the Future Nutrition Innovation Lab and leads the US government's Food Aid Quality Review. Until 2005, he worked in the United Nations World Food Program as Chief of Nutrition. And during that time, he was a first responder to the Asian tsunami disaster. And I'm going to pronounce that probably incorrectly, but Aka, I believe it is, or Asa?
Aceh.
Aceh, thank you. And was also part of the MDG Hunger Task Force reporting on, to Secretary General Kofi Annan and a member of the steering committee of the UN Standing Committee on Nutrition. Earlier, Dr. Webb spent 9 years with the International Food Policy Research Institute, known as IFPRI, and his high-level interactions with governments and donor organizations globally include work at ministerial levels in countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, North Korea, Kenya, Haiti, Cambodia, Timor-Leste, and Ethiopia. So thank you for joining us here today, Dr. Webb, and I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Ryan. And I will, it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. It's a great honor to be asked to present on this particular topic in this particular forum. It's going to be a little different probably from many, if not most, of the other presentations in this conference, partly because, calling this a workshop kind of implies that I know what I'm talking about. Right? It implies that I have some mastery over this, and I don't claim any mastery over effective oral presentation. I think I'm learning every single day, as are most of us. I see myself more as apprentice still than master, but that said, I'm very happy to share some thoughts. I'll try and keep this to 20, 30, no more than 30 minutes, and then open up for everyone else to share and dissect how they see the world from this particular perspective. Now, we all have seen, presentations like this where the presenter, says, "Oh, that's my phone," just when they're about to talk, right? Don't worry, I did that on purpose. Turn off your phone if you're going to communicate effectively. Lesson number one. Everyone has seen this kind of slide packed with words, and usually the presenter is saying, well, I know you can't read all of this, but anyway, I'm going to, and then they proceed to essentially read out most of the words, even if the person at the back of the room can't even begin to distinguish what is really the point of this slide. And honestly, talks are no different. Talks can be full of words that somebody at the back of the room simply cannot understand, right? They're jumbled, they're not coherent, they're too quiet. But we have to consider, we have to think about what the visual is doing for the words, what for the talk, and vice versa, right? The visual is in fact, so the PowerPoint in these days is in many ways the opening band for the main act. And the main act actually is you, the communicator. It should be supporting your words. Otherwise, conferences would simply make a PDF of everyone's presentations, email them to everyone, and assume that they would be read. And of course, they would not all get read. They're here. The people are in this room, in this conference, wherever you're speaking, because they actually want to hear you present, and you have to believe that. I will start by saying when I was in college, was chronically incapable of public speaking. And I'm not being immodest there, and I'm certainly not embellishing the truth. I was in a class in college where at one point the professor came up to me and said, "Webb," and this was in England, "Webb, you're not saying anything." And I kind of went, he said, "I know you have something to say from all your written work, but you're not saying anything in class. And I see that as a refusal to collaborate with your peers. And if you don't speak up, I'm going to fail you." Oh, all right. So I told myself things have to change. And they had to change to overcome hyperventilation, profuse sweating, tremors, grinding headaches, high blood pressure, whenever the thought came that I would have to put my hand up and ask for the floor. And I'm not exaggerating, right? I had to overcome this by dissecting what on earth was going on. What was the problem here, aside from mental issues? What was the problem? How was it that I was paralyzed in the setting of public speaking? And it came down to the fact that I didn't trust that I knew what I was talking about, and that I felt that I personally was going to be dissected for whatever I said. And it took understanding and breaking it out into what's the essence here. And I finally learned that it's really only two things that matter. What's new, and why should you care? Right? We can talk more about that and we can amplify that. But at the end of the day, any data-driven, research-based scientific presentation is essentially, truly essentially, trying to get at what's new here and why should you care? Why is it the so what question? What does it matter? And once I'd done that and started figuring out, all right, so then how do I communicate? How do I package what's new best to wow an audience? And how do I best communicate? Why do you care? Why should you be listening to me and believe me? Now, in all of this, please understand that I absolutely insist that science has to be based on rigor and transparency and effective method, and all of those things have to be communicated very clearly. But moving beyond that, for me, effective communication is effective communication. It moves beyond the use of PowerPoints or as the thing that is doing the communication to using PowerPoints as supporting the communication. When I moved to Tufts from the UN in 2005, I had several conversations with faculty then here about the film that had just come out, The Da Vinci Code. I'm not promoting it, and I hope I'm not contravening any copyright issues here. But several faculty here said, "Have you seen that film?" Not because of the film itself, but because right at the beginning, there's a few minutes which are essentially a primer of how to use PowerPoint effectively, how to communicate using the backdrop. And it was all about the backdrop being secondary to the words, and the words being amplified by the PowerPoint. Right? So that's really essential to the message I'm talking about. Now, I'm going to talk about these broad issues about content, about how to say what you're going to say or choosing what you're not going to say, and then a little bit about how you tailor messages for different audiences. And we'll go through each of those. And certainly you can raise issues and you can question and critique these things as we go along, but these are things that I felt worthy of putting on the table, sharing with you. How to capture audience attention? Well, it depends a little bit, not on the content, but certainly on the type of presentation, the type of platform that you're on. If you're the single presenter for a webinar or a seminar, you are the focus, and you have to deal with the material and the audience in that way. There's not, you're the main event because there is only that event. If you're on one of the lightning talks like tomorrow, the Food Plus 2021, 7-minute lightning talks with 10 other people, you're not the focus. You're one of many, and you're competing essentially for attention. That may require you to think a little differently about how you present, not what you present, how you present. If it's a scientific audience, well, actually, you're essentially grandstanding. You're trying to convince peers, future peers, hopefully, or donors, that you have what it takes. You know what is required to get the job done. And so again, you may want to change the tenor, the tone, the approach in different ways. But none of that changes what I said just now. What's new? Why should you care? That doesn't change with the audience. It's how you communicate that goes with the audience. How to structure messages? Well, in part, that is about how much time you have, right? Those lightning talks, 7 minutes. Why? It's amazing how much you can say in 7 minutes and communicate. It's also amazing how little you can say in 70 minutes. You have to think carefully and so that what you're saying doesn't just fill time, but is as coherent and clear in the time available as possible, right? So compression matters. It means simplification. Expansion can mean breaking it up into bite-sized chunks to keep the mind moving forward with the narrative. Some presenters like the structure of their presentation to be front-ended. Others want it to be rear-ended, and not rear-ended, back-ended, in terms of conclusions or thanks, here to counter to collaborators, right? But overall, don't just use time. Don't pad slides with content that you can actually verbally say, which is actually what I just did, right? I just said what was there. There's no need to do that, right? But you maybe use concise text, and I'll just give you an example of that, alongside complex visuals. But the bottom line here in terms of structuring messages is to figure out how to make that message coherent to the audience, regardless of how much time you have. Now, one example I just was saying, this is about climate impacts, greenhouse gas emissions across the food system, not just agriculture, which is 12% here. Agriculture and land use together, almost 20% of total emissions. But here is a complex diagram saying multiple complex things in actually fairly complex ways, right? If you work for the IPCC, you may just get this instantly. But if you don't, it may well be sensible to overlay a simple textual interpretation for this kind of data presentation and elaborate orally what it means, why this matters and what it means. And clearly there's things here about agriculture production actually being quite a small part of the total food system contribution to total emissions, and that ruminant methane, ruminants and rice, often seen as the main culprits in this area, actually a little bit less than change in land use, shifting for agriculture, deforestation and so on, right? So you can orally interpret this for the audience in a way that makes the data and the visual less complex. And of course, that speaks to other presentations you've had earlier, workshops, choice of data visualization and how to make those data visualizations work. But it's not as simple as just throwing a diagram or throwing an image onto the screen. Does that visual explain what are likely to be complex relationships in the data or across sectors or across issues better than just presenting data or using your own words to articulate, right? The visual has to be very, very clear and very, I would argue, standalone. Ideally, can it convey a message without you explaining it so that you can be amplifying that message orally rather than reiterating what people can actually see on the visual? So there's all kinds of complexity in visuals. Just a few examples. CRISPR is a gene editing technology, one of the latest ones. This is almost a poster. It's actually a graphic in science, but it tells a lot of different things. But what it can do, what it can be used in oral terms, is show a narrative flow. And for example, one narrative flow is China is using CRISPR almost as much as the US, pretty much roughly in the same amount in terms of medical applications, but much more in terms of agricultural applications than the US. As a result of that, China was responsible for about 42% of all the papers over those 3 years relating to CRISPR in agriculture. Number of papers that China is publishing using CRISPR has caught up with the United States, and yet citations of those papers lags far behind the US, right? There's a whole narrative there. In a couple of words, I spelled out a series of issues, and one could probably have a dozen different narratives spelled out from this one graphic, right? So you have to choose what you're going to lead the audience through. A couple of other examples. John Snow, the father of epi, the pump analysis relating to cholera in 1854. You could present the data, right, like this in terms of the dates, number of deaths, number of fatal attacks of cholera and deaths. Actually, John Snow established very quickly it's far better to communicate what was going on there through one of the first applications of geographic information systems, right? Plotting out where the deaths were in relation to pumps and simply articulating that each dot is a death, each cross is a pump, right? That's a visual that you can speak to, and the narrative obviously goes to, once he figured out where that pump, where the clusters of deaths were, he removed the handle from that pump and the cholera outbreak was over, right? Nice little narrative around it. So I'm emphasizing narrative flow here because presenting tables and data points and regressions, it matters. It matters for certain kinds of presentations. But the narrative flow is not always obvious. This one is a very clear graphic which has lots of complex data behind it, but it allows a flow. It has a flow. It talks about the life cycle, the problems of nutrition through the life cycle, the implications in orange of those the malnutrition forms through the life cycle, and some of the text to the side, some of the drivers of those malnutrition manifestations at different points in the life cycle. This allows a narrative flow. Another one, and I'll stop with this one, a food systems framework that talks about not just production, but all the way around accessibility, affordability, and desirability. I've presented this about 20 times in the last month, this particular diagram, to a range of audiences. And what I've realized was most effective was to not let the audience's eye do the normal round of clockwise interpretation. It's very common to look at a painting or to follow a visual of this kind clockwise. I therefore start talking about desirability and force the narrative backwards, counterclockwise, orally, right? It doesn't change the diagram. But I found that the audience actually has to concentrate more when I do this. By starting with why making healthy diets is the most important thing, because if it's not, they won't want it and they won't be able to, they won't choose to buy it, even if they can afford it. But of course, most 3 billion people can't afford it. And part of that is because it's not accessible to them because of food loss and waste and lack of infrastructure in markets and so on. And if it's going to be accessible, then of course it has to be produced. It has to be made available. So there are key elements. But I learned after about 2 presentations that counterclockwise was more helpful to getting engagement of the audience. Planning what you'll say. How do you manage time? Well, guess what? Stopwatch. Right? Now, you're used to have, oh dear, I'm failing here. I used to use a clock and found that that was confusing me. I had to do mental calculation. Okay, so 20 minutes out of what time was it? Oh God, I was having to use both sides of the brain at once. I never do that. I found the clock stopwatch was so much easier because it was a continuous countdown and you can know exactly where you're going to count down. Advice, finish before time, not at time. Having the moderators leap in and say, sorry, can you go to your conclusions? Sorry, you're over time now, I'm going to have to stop. Nothing more guaranteed to put you in a fluster and start, and then mixing your words and not being able to finish completely coherently. So don't have more to say than you can say in the time. For me, the rule of thumb is 2 minutes per slide. I know many people say, oh, no, I can get through 5 slides in a minute. Doesn't matter. 2 minutes per slide planning. So if you have 10 minutes, sorry, that's 5 slides. 30 minutes, that's 15 slides. You really have to plan that way. Figure out what works for you, but that's the kind of thing you need to focus on to enable your oral presentation to be coherent and not rushed. Find slide numbers. That can help also because you can get a sense. Oh, all right, I'm on slide number 13. That helps me to keep track of how many slides per minute. But it can also help the audience understand if they know that you've got 20 slides, you can say that at the beginning, they can get a sense of progression, and that actually helps engagement. How to emphasize messages? How do you emphasize main messages? Pause. Emphasis, mix it up. You've got to repeat, you've got to pause, you've got to change the cadence, you've got to smile, you've got to do things that wake up the audience. How many conferences have you been in the dark room on the Wednesday afternoon where half the audience is asleep, right? That's not helpful. So emphasizing main messages, punctuating your talk with key messages, with actually what's the distilled evidence from these 3 slides we've seen so far, and why does that matter to the next 3 slides? All public speaking is a performance of some kind, right? And that's what I had to learn. That's what I had to establish. How do you communicate with people? And I'm joking, but I'm not really too joking. Communicate as if you're talking to your friend or your dog. You wouldn't just drone on endlessly going through regression result after regression result. No, you wouldn't, right? Consider your audience your dog and treat them accordingly. They need fun. They need to be played with. Slight digression. My father was a magician, a semi-professional magician, and I was his assistant. I was on stage at a very early age, literally on stage, helping him as his assistant, being cut in half, having gallons of water poured in my ear, actually mainly looking after the rabbits and turtle doves to make sure they didn't disappear before they were made to disappear. These things kind of matter. And I learned from him and all the magic conventions that we went to and the clubs and so on, that actually magicians are masters at oral communication. It's the patter, it's their ability to guide the audience, to direct the audience towards what they want them to see or believe. And that's essentially that kind of performance. And I'm going to see if this even works on Zoom. So here we have a coin, right? Solid silver coin. And I don't know if this thing can work in Zoom, but I put it in the hand, and I'm going to ask all of you on the count of 3 to blow. Ready? 1, 2, 3, blow. Wow, it even works through Zoom. That's amazing. Now, what that was an example of misdirection, obviously, right? I don't know where the penny went, the coin went. It must be here somewhere. But anyway, I forced you to think about what I wanted you to think about, which was the coin being in this hand, and that maybe or not, it might disappear. I'm saying that because this aspect of performance, everyone can learn, and it's about direction, right? So you can have tables full of data that are complex, right? This has two different columns saying very different things. It has lots of different numbers. And if you're nervous, if you're having a hard time keeping track of the time, this kind of table becomes very complex and very challenging. You can lose your way of what was the main point. It's much easier to articulate for yourself as much as for the audience where you want them to focus. The green circles are the positives, the biggest change, the negatives are the red. And you can very quickly say what we want to see. What's happening here is consumption of supply of meat and dairy products, strongly linked with percentage change in job stunting and so on, right? It's direction. You're directing the audience where you want them to see things. You can also have fun, right? Again, as I said, with your dog. Now, this at a meeting a few years back of the International Atomic Energy Agency, big meeting full of 300, 400 international scientists. We were talking about data, and I was talking about the evidence base for treating acute malnutrition. Do a quick slide on evidence review, that evidence is extremely lacking, and that there's a dearth, I can never remember how you pronounce that, dearth, that's it, of data, and that we don't have enough answers. Now, you might think that was childish, and you probably do think that was childish, but the room exploded in laughter when I did that. These were all hardcore scientists who obviously had a lot of pent-up emotion that was released by that one little joke, right? And so I've had more people come up after saying, that was so great, than any other presentation, which was a lot more sensible. But anyway, planning. What to listen for yourself. Well, always, when you're listening to presentations, don't just look at the slides and don't just look at the results. Ask yourself, if you like to talk, why? What was it about how that was communicated that made it easy for you to digest and to get the message that was being conveyed? And of course, the flip side is what made you hate certain presentations. Before you forget them, just think about, all right, God, that was bad. Why? Why was that so bad? Do they really need cats and babies? No. Varied approaches for different audiences, and you're coming rapidly to the end according to my stopwatch. Style of communication. Now, at the end of the day, you, of course, again, I emphasize rigor. I emphasize that if you are being asked to present something, you are an authority. You have to be therefore authoritative. You have to know your material, but you also need to tailor to the audience. So operational agencies, their main interest is tell me, what should I do based on, what is the evidence that we have that this makes sense or is cost effective. Talking to Congress, very different. It's like talking to kindergarten. Why are we doing this? Why should we do this? What kind of impact is there? What is hunger after all? And why do people die? Scientists, obviously, very interested in the method, but also how much can we generalize from what findings are presented, and also what are knowledge gaps based on your findings that need to be prioritized. So, some audiences are very narrowly sectoral or disciplinary based. Others are very diverse and quite heterogeneous. And you really do need to try and understand that ahead of time and tailor the cadence, the emphasis of message, and the detail, the level of detail accordingly. Again, I'm going to talk about just two slides showing from a recent presentation I made to it was an all of staff USAID global meeting, and they asked me to present the slides ahead of time, and I had several like this, and they came back. He said, "Oh no, look, you can't have the big tables with lots of numbers and stars. I mean, it's not going to go down well. It's not going to fly. They're not going to understand. And I pushed back and said, sorry, I'm giving the talk. And so all I did was the emphasis, the direction to the audience, and simply showed this without trying to explain effect 2014 over 2012 and so on, but simply said, what we found from this panel survey, large, 3,500 households, was that over time, a multi-sector program did have a positive effect on the consumption of certain nutrient-rich foods like fruits and vegetables and meats. That's it, right? It was all in the message. And everyone in that global meeting said that was so clear, but you also didn't treat us like dummies. Thank you. Talking of treating like dummies, so many presentations have cats or cute babies, or babies and cute cats, and so many agency presentations have images that actually become distracting. I had more people asking me, where did I take this picture of a yak, than questions about the content of the slide, which was the conclusions, for goodness sake. It was about, here are my main messages, right? So beware and be careful when you have images that actually are quite striking. They can detract, right? And that's not the purpose of this. And finally, I was asked, has anything changed during COVID? Well, yeah, of course, some things have changed. Like, I've had to totally redecorate this room so that the backdrop is completely acceptable in some way. Huge cost. I think multitasking is something we've learned for presentations, right? It's hard to present and monitor the chat, and yet it can be very, very useful because it can allow you to amplify, explain, change tack in midstream, right? Because you can see, you can watch what people are confused by or are considering to be quite useful. Beware, obviously everyone knows by now, you have to beware of your setting. Pets, I'm actually using my cat's cat tower as my standing desk here. And yes, periodically we do have accidents. It is tough because you can't see the audience. So there is a lack. You can see faces more or less if they've got their video on. But you don't see body language. You can't hear the ambiance of the room. And those two things are, in fact, quite important for the performance. But you have to try and find ways to do that. One of the positives that I like a lot is seeing people's names, so you don't have to memorize everyone, or you can actually call out people specifically. And I think that makes for a more personal interaction despite this gap, this spatial gap between us. So conclusions, and I'll stop. I'm a little bit over. Be clear, be very, very clear in your own mind, those two elements. Why the content is new, what is it about it that's novel, why are you presenting it? And why should the audience care about it? Understand before the meeting, digestible takeaway messages. Many, many meetings where you do a good presentation, you will be a reporter or someone will come up to you immediately afterwards and say, "Oh, that was great. Can you tell me more about this?" And what they're looking for is 3 sound bites, 3 short, distilled, digestible messages that are for a lay audience, essentially, that come from your talk. And you're going to need those unless you look a little bit stupid. Keep essential information to a minimum. People can always ask questions, and always end on a big bang, arousing note, rather than a quiet thank you. Don't peter out. And maybe that doesn't need to be said, but I used to, for many years, feel that it was better to have the modest petering out, almost to a silent thank you, because it was equivalent to getting the audience to lean in because they're trying to hear you. I don't agree that anymore. I think you need a rousing finish. They need, if you've been conveying, articulating well your messages, doing your performance, you don't end it with a whimper. You end it with a bang. Less is more, fewer slides, fewer content. Let your words communicate the essential nature of your work. Practice, of course. Technologies always fail, always fail. So it's hard to stay calm, but you need to practice technology glitches, not just presenting what you have, but presenting and then having someone pull the plug and then figuring out how to get back online and so on. And ultimately, don't rush. Walk with your dog. Express your excitement in the work that you've done and why you're sharing it, and empathize with the audience who is sitting there having to listen to you. So I will stop there and thank you, and more than happy to take questions and listen and hear other people's perspectives on this topic. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick. Now I feel like every presentation I've ever given is a lost cause because I didn't do a magic trick or talk about a yak. So I really appreciate that. No, it really is wonderful to get your perspective. Obviously, you've done presentations on numerous levels with various audiences of from a general audience to a scientific audience and everywhere pretty much in between. I think one of the main emphasis that we always talk about, at least in some of our works as in our research lab, is peer feedback. You talked a lot about making sure that you communicate clear points, that you have proper emphasis on your points, and more importantly, that when you're giving a presentation, less is more and the message is most important. So when it comes to feedback, what are the types of feedback then that you're trying to solicit as you're practicing or as you're presenting? What are the types of feedback that you find most useful or least useful to be able to really hone in on what your key message should be for your audience?
Sorry, can you package that the question again?
The question being peer feedback. What's good peer feedback, poor peer feedback, and why?
Well, the very quickly, you get us. You have to swallow your pride frequently, right? When you realize that most of the questions are actually about explanation, right, as opposed to methodology or findings, interpretation, right? But if you realize early on that people are asking questions that you thought you were either self-explanatory or needed explanation, but you didn't give it, that is peer feedback that is peerless, because it means you have to emphasize explaining what you're talking about to a variety of different audiences, right? They would assume, what's going on. But eliciting peer feedback directly through practice sessions is also extremely helpful. And at the end of the day, you do it as often as you can, as frequently as you can. Volunteer to do feedback sessions. Volunteer to be a rapporteur and feedback to plenary. Volunteer to give presentations to student group. Whatever it is, the more frequently you do it, the more feedback you'll get, but also obviously more confidence you'll get.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Questions? Any questions, folks? Feel free to please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I have questions, and I'm sure Elena also has questions that we can ask for days. But seeing none, I guess I'll continue.
Well, I do see one in the chat.
Okay. Oh, yes.
I'm a second. Hello, Shimilis.
Yes.
The same is written in the PDF. Do you mean the PDF as in a published manuscript, or are you essentially saying that the presentation follows what is there in the manuscript, or does it go beyond that? You can try and clarify that. At the end of the day, you can obviously a manuscript guides many presentations. Some are done before the manuscript is published, others are done after the manuscript is published. But don't, I think what you're asking, my answer would be no, don't try and mimic orally what you have written in the paper, right? Spend greater time explaining context, what is novel about this, actually things that are not required in a manuscript by the editors. When you have a presentation, you have much more flexibility to amplify on why you did this, why you think the interpretations are the way they are, right? Because you're not limited to a word count, you're limited to literally how many words you can say in 30 minutes. But no, it's kind of deadly to try and just simply mimic a manuscript. It should be a different product based on that manuscript.
Wonderful. We had another question. So how do you handle presenting to a mixed audience, for example, at a multidisciplinary conference where some disciplines may expect very technical language that people from other disciplines will not understand or resonate with?
No, that's obviously something we're all facing more and more. I think you have to try and choose language that is not so technical or so bound by a discipline that many others won't understand it. That includes acronyms, obviously. Many people get stuck using acronyms from their own professional world, and most people won't understand them. So use that as an example, right? You need to talk. It doesn't mean dumbing down. You absolutely can talk eloquently and rigorously, but in a language that doesn't reside in, like the definition of CRISPR, which I've already forgot, even though I spelled it out. You can use, complex words, or you can say gene editing, right? And more people will understand that. So I think you can't, in time-bound settings, explain everything, nor should you. If there are specific, problems in understanding, then people will ask that in the Q&A. But at the end of the day, you can't, you have, if you're talking to multiple disciplines, try and talk to them as smart peers who, if you use the right kind of language, should be able to understand most of what you're saying.
Wonderful. We had another follow-up question. If you're presenting to an audience you're not familiar with, what strategies do you use to figure out how you might tailor your presentation or your main message?
I always, when invited to speak, I invariably ask whoever invited me what to expect, right? At the very least, who's likely to be there, what's their background, what are they interested in. To some extent, I do some background homework on the institution, that group within that institution, to get a sense of, at least broadly, the world they're in, their worldview, their priorities in that worldview, and try and essentially speak in that context, right? I think it's very important that issue of setting what you're saying in a context is part of understanding your audience. So if you're talking about restricting meat consumption to an audience concerned with climate change, then obviously you have to speak to the context of climate change, ruminant emissions, the dialogue, the debate around animal source foods, right? Just to give it a context and then dive in.
And maybe in terms of context, this may be in part some advice, maybe some resonating over how you prepared as well. But thinking about advice for someone preparing for their dissertation defense, maybe you can speak to maybe what you did in your defense, or how you maybe advise individuals who you oversee on how maybe they should prepare for their defenses.
That's a good question. I think that the general response from most faculty would be that what the committee, the exam committee, is looking for is the student's ability, the candidate's ability to synthesize complex information from multiple sources, explain it coherently, essentially my first few slides, in a way that the three people who are actually typically from different backgrounds and disciplines, where everyone in that committee can understand it, right? So an ability to distill synthetically and communicate coherently and simply. Those are the skill sets, right? That's the essence of good oral communication. So it doesn't really matter whether it's dissertation defense, where you've prepped on some specified topics, and you're having to think on your feet, right? Because the questions are coming fast and furious, and you're having to think, okay, right, I read that, I know this, I have been there, and you're trying to communicate effectively under pressure, in a small amount of time, in a way that convinces that particular audience that you are ready to be an independent researcher, right? And so that rigor has to still be there. But everything I've said could apply to your dissertation defense, except for the Darth Vader picture.
Well, yeah, and then following up on the Darth Vader picture, how did you, I guess, know that that was going to be interpreted well? Or for example, of all the examples you could have come up with today about ways of deceiving an audience, or being able to ensure that the emphasis of the audience's perspective was to be focused on where you wanted them to focus, you chose to pull up a magic trick today. So what kind of, besides obviously resonating with that personally in your own life, I mean, what are the types of things that you consider on terms of how to interject maybe some of that comedic relief or satire into a presentation that's taken tastefully but not distracting?
Yeah, and that's a great question from Jen. So I thought long and hard today about whether or not to do this, right? You have, you don't, it's not just a knee-jerk thing. But so I did it for effect, right? I did it to explain my next point about directing the audience. And so you have to be thinking through what are potentially effective ways for different kinds of audiences, certainly not to shock, and certainly not to be gratuitously funny, but to bring people's attention back to, okay, what are we talking about here? Because minds wander. People are looking at their phones, they start scribbling notes, and in any venue, people get distracted. And so there's so many ways that you could, things you could do to try and bring the mind back, bring mindfulness back to where it needs to be. And I do see a value in jokes. Obviously, cross-culturally, that can be an issue, and you never know how yes, a senior scientist may simply not like it, and there will be some, but if you're not willing to take that risk, then too bad on that senior researcher for not getting it. But I do like props. I mean, I just for effect, for emphasis, bringing things that would be unexpected, right? As some of you who've been in any classes know, sometimes I've used the cigar that Fidel Castro gave me personally, right? It's a great little thing. It's like, oh, really? What? Or a medal I was given by a mayor from a little village, remote mountains of North Korea, a medal for universal happiness and well-being, or something like that. And because of what I was done. But you can create slight digressions, slight little storylines, but they're only going to be effective if they are for a purpose. And you can articulate that purpose very quickly and clearly, and the audience gets it.
Yeah, and also to contextualize. I mean, there's been many presentations I've sat in with you where you were kind of demonstrating what is the ration that maybe an individual might get, or if it's food aid, what is the type of food aid, or the amount of food aid that might be given, and you're able to just pick up a milk crate and say, this is it, and I think it really does have a lot of really impactful understanding, contextualizing of situations, which oftentimes in our research we're usually talking in the abstract, right? As much as we might be working in the concrete. We're talking about the abstract, and I think it just is so vital. Um,
Yeah.
and with that, maybe, in terms of rehearsing those types of things, maybe what are the types of strategies that you use when you're rehearsing? I know you said trying to finish obviously before your time runs out, which I think reminds me back to a phrase that I heard, which is early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable. That was
Right.
a mantra that we had when we
Yeah.
were, in the sports side of the community. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, kind of, what are the techniques that you tend to use? Because I know people tend to do what works for them, and maybe just sharing what works for you.
No, I mean, so rehearsing matters. It matters more early on in your career, because obviously the more you do it, the more you know yourself, and you know how much you can. If you're not careful, you start digressing or start telling stories or going off on tangents, right? Or not. But the more you do it, the more your comfort level in your own ability to manage the time. But early on, you absolutely have to rehearse to understand your way of communicating, how long it really takes you to get through a point, not just a slide, but communicate a point or a message. Right? So doing those presentations to a friend, to yourself, timing it, it matters. And I still today count my number of slides, and with a 2-minute per slide rule, I can just glance and say, oh, I've got too many slides. I need to cut 3. All right. So that's where you get by that at a certain point.
And yeah, you're probably reading the same
Yeah.
same new question that I am too. But
Yeah.
this idea that for many of the students, perhaps on the call, they may have actually done practices in front of scientific researchers or fellow peers at conferences, but speaking in front of Congress,
Mm-hmm.
working as a director in the UN, you've
Mm-hmm.
had the opportunity to speak at high levels in front of very well esteemed organizations. So what changes? What may be different, or what are maybe some of the experiences that you've had or topics that you've been asked to cover?
The main thing that strikes me about those kind of audiences is that they're pretty happy if you talk about concrete examples of, particularly of what works. They're not so keen on what doesn't work, right? They like to understand whether a policy or a program design or an intervention of whatever kind had an impact, made a difference, right? And their view of the outcome isn't the p value. It's descriptive of the potential impact, the potential change in people's lives, the potential cost savings to a government, the potential engagement of a community that wasn't engaged, right? They like examples. And if you couch it descriptively, still rigorously, and you can refer to, yes, this has been carefully studied, rigorously studied, there are publications on this, I can share them with you after this meeting if you're interested. Those things matter. They're always concerned about, is it feasibility, political feasibility? Of course they have to be. So any idea that you put on the table, they don't want just a problem described. They will invariably ask, so, well, what can we do about this? What are the potential solutions? And those solutions have to be carefully thought through, right? A lot of scientists, and this is not any smear on anyone, many scientists do research, come up with a paper, and the policy implications part is an afterthought, and it's often poorly thought after. But if you're talking to Congress or policy-making bodies, they'll see you through you in a second. If you're going to go in front of those audiences, you need to be able to talk about policy options or investment options, or why choosing this versus that makes a difference, or potentially could make a difference. They want ideas, they want initiatives, but they want them to be politically desirable. So don't go suggesting let's say, a policy-making body at the USDA that the best thing for climate change is to slaughter all the livestock in the US, right? I mean, that might not go down as seen as politically feasible. Just to, do some homework, consult with colleagues, consult with other students. That is the so what question of all research, and it's too often left as an afterthought, as I say. But these audiences, their focus is the so what, right? Why should I care? That's why I see it as one of the two pillars. What's new? Why should you care? You need to be able to communicate that.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough, Patrick, for being here. This was really wonderful, I think, for a lot of the students as we begin to work through whatever types of oral presentations we plan to give in the near future, certainly over Zoom for the foreseeable future. And taking a leaf out of your page, I think I'll end a little bit early so that we can then transition into the next meeting that we have going on. But just want to thank you very much for obviously your presentation here today. I'm sure many folks have already been asking me about the recordings that will be coming. So thank you. I thank you very much, Patrick. And I look forward to seeing everyone in the next session.
Thank all of you. And thank you, Brian, and others for setting this up. Appreciate it.